Yes, there is disinformation. Yes, there is hate speech, but there are particular political actors who are hyping the threat, and they're weaponizing it as a tactic to silence their opposition. There's this worldview, which is there are people who have access to the truth and know how to access the truth, and there are people who don't. And the people who can access the truth and determine what is true and false by that special status have the right to then determine the scope of public discourse and what content can and cannot exist on the internet. And so it's kind of like priests and peasants in a way, that only some people can access this and other people can't.
I'm sitting here with Andrew Löwenthal. Obviously, there's some German heritage there. You're an Australian citizen and a digital rights activist who is the director and founder of Libernet, also another digital rights foundation that you are no longer the head of, as far as I'm concerned.
Engage Media, I'm no longer the head of, and Libernet, yes.
Yes. Libernet is an initiative that's working on reestablishing free speech online and is uncovering digital authoritarianism. And you were also part of the Matt Taibbi team that was part of the releasing the Twitter files back in 2022, back when Elon Musk overtook Twitter.
Yep.
Very interesting. This will not be the centerpiece of this discussion, but it's super interesting to look at that. We're here to discuss the censorship regime in Germany because you were invited to work on an extensive report, which I'm linking down below. I'm also linking it in the comments for everyone to read. It's very interesting to look at. Anyway, you were invited to work on this extensive report, and you also presented it at the EU.
Well, I wouldn't say I was invited. I basically invited myself.
You invited yourself to present it at the EU, but you were able to do it.
Oh, well, I was invited to the EU by Thomas Geisel from BSV to present it. But I guess in terms of the initiative, I decided myself, I guess there wasn't so much someone inviting me that this was something that I thought I had some expertise in. Not necessarily everything in terms of the kind of German politics and context, being a kind of German citizen, but having grown up in Australia and having limited kind of background or actually time spent in Germany, but a lot of time working on censorship issues around the world and having mapped this network in the US, I thought, well, could I work with people in Germany to do something similar?
So you kind of already went ahead and answered my question. Why in the hell is an Australian citizen, okay, you have a second citizenship to Germany, okay? Anyway.
Essentially Australian.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm essentially Australian. Why are you looking at censorship in Germany? How did that start?
Well, I guess I'm generally concerned about censorship globally. Previously, I focused on censorship in Southeast Asia. So I guess you could also ask the question, why was an Australian in Southeast Asia working with people on
it's geographically closer.
Yeah, it's geographically closer. Australia at that time, I wasn't quite so concerned about. I knew a bunch of people in Southeast Asia. I had a skill set that I thought would be useful to them. There was a kind of gap in a way, and I was able to raise funding and find collaborators to work on those issues in places like Myanmar and the Philippines, Indonesia, etc. And then it shifted a few years ago to focus more on the West again, because I think in the last 10 years, particularly since COVID, the kind of speech environment in the West has become very, very bad. And it's become particularly bad. Well, it's still bad in the US, but in a different way under Trump, under Biden, and under Trump 1.0. It was very, very bad in terms of obviously not just the cancel culture, but the digital aspects of it. And that was some of the stuff that was revealed through the Twitter files. The kind of nature of free speech suppression in the US is now very different, but the regime that essentially operated in the US is still very much the way things happen in Europe and the UK and in Australia. So in looking at, well, who's the next, or what's the next worst place globally for censorship in the West, it seemed to me that it was some can duke it out for top three, whether it's essentially the EU as an entity, not the whole of the EU, Britain or Germany. So I don't know who's exactly worse, but those seem to me to be the places where it is currently the worst. The kind of restrictions are the worst, and you hear the worst stories about these dawn raids that happen in Germany, and obviously in the UK you hear also about all these police raids and door knocks of these non-crime hate incidents that they happen that they claim are an issue in the UK that now I think the police are starting to pull back on. But essentially, because of Germany's role as the largest economy in the bloc, its large cultural influence and its heavy speech suppression, I think it's basically a very, very important place to be focusing attention in terms of thinking about not just what happens in Germany, but also how Germany influences the world and particularly the EU.
So you said the UK, Germany, and the EU as an entity.
Yeah, so when I say the EU, I don't mean all 40-something.
27.
Or 27, so 45 European countries, 27 member states. I mean in the sense of the kind of the Commission and the things like the DSA.
Can you explain, just to differentiate so that we can take a closer look at Germany, but since the EU and the Commission, the laws, have a grave influence on how we do things here, how can you differentiate the fact that Germany is part of the EU, but the speech suppression is so much worse in Germany than in the other EU countries, although we're all under the same EU Commission umbrella. So what's happening there?
It's a very good question. I think obviously there still is some amount of autonomy that each state has within the EU. It's not that everyone behaves 100% equally. I also think that there's a kind of relationship between EU and Germany that, a lot of the kind of DSA also comes from the NetzDG.
DSA is Digital Services Act.
And so there's kind of an interplay there, but you don't hear as much of this suppression, sure, in other places as much, say in Spain, in Italy. So I think partly that's probably history and it's the context. So I think here people are much more concerned or much more on edge because of kind of right populism and the history of Germany. And I think there's a kind of, never again mentality. I mean, these things obviously are real and justified, and some amount of that type of thinking is useful. And then at some point it becomes too much, or it becomes weaponized as well. And so one of my big issues is that, yes, there is disinformation, yes, there is hate speech, but there are particular political actors who are hyping the threat, and they're weaponizing it as a tactic to silence their opposition. And they're actually making the issue of disinformation worse by essentially turning it into a political tool.
So let's take a look at Germany, because the report is titled "The Censorship Network in Germany." So let's maybe look at the censorship network or the censorship regime. Can you tell me what that is? How would you define it?
I would define it as, and it's very similar in many respects to say what we found in the US and in other countries, which is that it's a network that is made up of government ministries and agencies, NGOs, academic centers, think tanks, liberal foundations, fact-checking entities and kind of media organizations and various kind of for-profit consultancies, I think, form the kind of main kind of components of who's actually involved. It's not that there's necessarily one centralized kind of thing that is directing this, but there's very particular nodes that are very, very influential in saying, so if a foundation or a ministry that's handing out lots and lots of money, like Demokratie Leben,
Demokratie Leben.
Then they can turn the focus of civil society to now we need to panic about disinformation, or now this is the biggest issue, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole range of NGOs that are out there that are basically going to sign up and say, okay, well, I would like €500,000 grant, or I'd like €1 million grant, and I'm happy to go out there and flag disinformation online and report it to the police or the government or the platforms essentially. So, and a lot of the times these NGOs are really operating as quasi-government entities, right? They're oftentimes the majority of their budget is from the government. It's not from independent sources. And this is not really what, to my mind, civil society should be. Actually, civil society should be a watchdog on power, not working with power to then go and suppress speech of what is actually often kind of little people, everyday people. And that the same with the role of the fact checkers is that so much of the fact checking is, some random guy in some rural village saying something rude and obnoxious, rather than, well, what about the disinformation that comes from the government, from the health minister, from the, foreign minister, from what, that's where those kind of resources should be directed. But it seems to be that a lot of these resources are really directed kind of downward on the people rather than upward towards the decision makers and the people with the most power.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a few things to unpack, and the fact that obviously this network, the censorship network, is not being fed because it's supposed to censor. It's supposed to combat disinformation. And I think we need to make that quite clear, that the money is being funneled to different institutions. And the goal is to combat disinformation, and not, the primary goal is not to censor.
Well, yeah, it's presented as combating disinformation or combating hate speech. And also censorship is thought of as a non-neutral term, but in some ways censorship, if you think about it just in a kind of neutral way, just means, did you remove something? Did you remove some content or not? Sometimes you actually might want to remove something. Actually, it's interesting in New Zealand that they have an office of censorship, and they just kind of say it out loud. And it's
really?
Yeah, but it does things like classify movies, like a G, PG, M, and this kind of stuff. And it just is like, and it's actually quite honest in a way. It's like, there are some things that are not allowed, and I'm not a kind of free speech absolutist. So, I would like there to be agencies that are policing child pornography and censoring them from the internet. I think I support that. But we think of it as a kind of entirely kind of negative term in a sense. I mean, it is, but we can also think of it as like, are you subtracting content from the digital environment? Yes, you're censoring. Is your censorship justified or not? Is another question. But also oftentimes we talk at the same time about content controls, because oftentimes when people think about censorship, they think about it in a very particular kind of way. Is this very kind of heavy-handed, this post disappears, that post disappears. Oftentimes it's much more sophisticated than that. And a lot of the work that might be being done, say around a lot of the programs in Germany, kind of media literacy and education programs, are not necessarily taking content down, but they're kind of instructing students in a particular kind of worldview of like, conspiracy thinking, but oftentimes conspiracy thinking is, well, you have a different opinion than the government. I mean, obviously there are some people who take that way too far, but again, this whole thing, to my mind, is a kind of political program that is designed to combat kind of political insurgents, whether they're on the left or the right, who are challenging the establishment. And it's done under this banner of this kind of neutral, we just want to make the internet nicer and safer and more truthful. But under that, if you kind of lift up the hood, you can see that actually the people who are having their content taken down, yes, sometimes they're saying horrible things, sometimes they're genuinely spreading disinformation. There are real foreign actors who are trying to kind of inject content into social media platforms, but a lot of the time it's just ordinary citizens who have the wrong opinion.
I want to quote the report, and it says, working with a host of German specialists, so it was obviously not just you working on this report.
No, we had at least 7 or 8 people working with us.
Working with a host of German specialists, researchers, and advisors, we documented more than 300 organizations contributing to online content suppression activities in Germany, far beyond the scale we had anticipated. It's interesting. Our research indicates that the German government maintains an unusually close relationship with organizations that present themselves as independent, far more than in the United States, where we have conducted similar research. So there were some German particularities, and a few of those were that the government, it worked so freely with these so-called civil entities, right?
And openly.
Openly, yeah. And we know this. So yesterday at the presentation, you were like, I was surprised at how open all of this is. But why were you surprised about that? Because that's all I know.
Right. Well, I guess I was surprised in that in the US, where I've spent kind of most of my time kind of focusing on this issue, and in part in Australia, the government tries to obfuscate and kind of pretend that it's not doing it. In the US, it's particularly because of the First Amendment. The government really can't be seen to be putting its hand on the scales of kind of content moderation decisions. So there's a lot of, and this is why the Twitter files, I would say, were so important, because there was so much obfuscation that you just couldn't see it, that the government was funding these NGOs and working with these academic labs, and they weren't kind of being transparent. Here whilst there are some free speech protections in Germany, they're just not as rigorous. And so the government doesn't have to hide how, and it's just normalized, right? And so you also just think it's normal. But of course the government can pay NGOs to flag content to get it taken off the internet and have zero kind of air gap, space between, or separation between state and civil society. And I would argue that separation between state and civil society is very, very important for a functioning democracy.
So further German particularities that you mentioned yesterday in the presentation, that are also, I don't know if they're if they're in the report, if there's a list of German particularities in the report. I don't think so, but in the presentation, you pointed out that there were certain things that popped up more so in Germany than in other places that you looked at, and that were things that were, well, I'll just list them and then we go from there. So German particularities were the threat to democracy. That was something that these organizations were fighting against, right? Against people that are a threat to democracy.
Yeah, or content that they would designate as a threat to democracy.
Not people, the content. Conspiracies.
Yeah.
And the third that we just discussed is that civil society was working so closely with the government. So these three things were particular to Germany.
Even though there is a lot of panic in the US as well, that, right populism is going to end democracy, et cetera, I think it seems to me, again, as an outsider here, that the angst or the panic is higher here. And again, for very, very understandable reasons. The point is at what point, or up to what point, is that kind of anguish justifiable? To go, okay, and what point does it start kind of going too far? And at what point do some people start strategically weaponizing it to go, well, this is a way that we can counter, instead of actually dealing with the issues that are being raised by a large section of the population, we can just declare their concerns completely illegitimate because they're either they're hateful, they're disinformation, they're a threat to democracy, they're conspiracies, etc. Which isn't to say there isn't some of that in that mix, but the brush has been, it's been painted way too broadly, basically.
So I quoted out of the report that you guys documented about 300 organizations contributing to online content suppression. So looking at these 300 organizations, which is pretty big ecosystem, I would say, could you break down, at least in some parts, the functional division of that labor? You have different organizations, names that will be familiar are Hate Aid or the Antonio Amadeo Stiftung. And then you have fact-checking that are part of the DPA or DP8 or whatever. So could you maybe kind of help us look at how you mapped it and what the division of labor is?
Well, I'd say the first division of labor that's actually the most important is the money. So who actually provides the money for the work to even take place? I mean, there was a skew in our research towards the government money because actually the government money it's actually quite transparent in terms of going onto the various government
the
sites and other
Demokratieleben
things.
grants, right?
Yeah, they're all
check.
published. You can see them. So that, I mean, and then that's good, as it should be. Maybe we have low expectations that we're like, oh, wow, it actually wasn't so hard to find out how the government is spending the public's money. We probably shouldn't have such low expectations. We should probably think of that as a baseline in any country. In any case, so that means that what we're able to map, the private money, is a lot harder to kind of find, or it certainly takes a lot more work. But it's very, very clear that there's a huge amount of money coming out of the government, and it's going to, well, in the case of Demokratieleben, it's kind of, I think they made more than 170 of the 425 grants that we tracked. So they're kind of representing more than a third of all of the grants, not necessarily a third of all of the money, but also that's a very significant entanglement in terms of every grant is a relationship. And oftentimes it's like 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 grants that are going to particular organizations as well. So it means that's a lot of staff that you have to do that. It's a lot of people maintaining relationships with different organizations. So anyway, so there's the money, which is a mix of public and private, but I think more so public here than private. There are the kind of fact checkers who are and the kind of flaggers who are like going online and finding the content, and some of them might be reporting it to police, some are reporting it to ministry, some people are reporting it to platforms, etc. Some are doing education initiatives and kind of going out into schools to do that. Others are doing research initiatives, so there's quite a big kind of academic.
So not all of it is content control.
No. Well, not all of it is kind of direct kind of content controls of flagging some tweet or something and saying, take that off the internet. No, I would even say that's definitely not the majority of the work. There's this whole ecosystem. And one part of the problem with the ecosystem, and that's why we kind of said content controls more broadly rather than just censorship, excuse me, is that there's this worldview, which is there are people who have access to the truth and know how to access the truth, and there are people who don't. And the people who can access the truth and determine what is true and false, by that special status, have the right to then determine the scope of public discourse and what content can and cannot exist on the internet. And so it's kind of like priests and peasants in a way, that only some people can access this and other people can't.
So you were talking about government grants, but I read in the report that it's not just governments that are funding money. So let me read this to you. Google's news initiative has bankrolled Correctiv, DPA Infocom, and the EMIF, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, Marketing Industry Support as Philanthropy. Then you have TikTok under EU scrutiny, pays AFP and DPA for fact-checking, and sponsors Amadeo Antonio Foundation workshops, integrating its moderation with continental regulatory priorities. So you have the big social media companies, or Google, even bigger. They also fund money or funnel money into these organizations.
Well, and this is what was happening in the US pre-Trump 2.0 was that, but it's still happening essentially everywhere, as I understand, outside the US, which is that Facebook, for example, was paying NGO fact checkers basically to fact check its content, all people's content on the internet.
But they have to, right?
And so in Europe, they still do that, and I believe they do have to do that, and that's also part of the DSA as well. But the problem is that these NGOs, and I say this also, like just a little slightly more background on me. I mean, I ran a kind of digital rights NGO. I was in the kind of progressive left kind of world doing this kind of digital rights online or digital human rights work in Asia. And there's a very particular worldview of those NGOs. I mean, there's not very much intellectual diversity within the NGO sector. It has a very particular worldview about what is right and what is wrong, and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And so you're basically kind of getting a center-left, cosmopolitan, metropolitan kind of, you could also say woke worldview that is then, and then those people are going out and deciding what is true and false or acceptable and not acceptable, at the same time as presenting themselves as neutral, which they entirely aren't. But oftentimes they think, having talked to many of them, they think they are. They really think they sit kind of above the fray, and they're able to kind of see truth from falsehood. But if you go back through and look at, take any controversial issue, say COVID, I mean, you can go back through these fact checkers' websites, and oftentimes they still have their fact checks from COVID up, and they'll have so many things wrong. Like, I think yesterday we were talking about, Fakten Fuchs has a fact check saying that mandatory vaccination was a conspiracy theory, that would ever be proposed, but it was proposed. I mean, it didn't come in, I think, entirely in Germany, but it was certainly proposed as an idea, and it came in Austria, and it was certainly made mandatory in many, for many companies or universities or various other things, depending on the country. So, but that's one of literally thousands of wrong fact checks that you could go through now and find.
So, in the report, you guys quote a recent poll of Germans published by the European revealed that 84% of respondents reported having refrained from expressing their views out of fear of repercussions. And now I'm wondering at what point does widespread self-censorship cease to be a symptom and become perhaps the actual objective of the system?
Oh, it's entirely the objective of the system. Well, it's meant to chill speech. I mean, in some ways, there's speech that I think should be chilled as well. So, explicitly kind of racist taunts or people shouting racist things in the street to people. Like, I think that should be chilled. I don't think that's a good thing, and that if you want less of that in your society. The problem is, like, where's the boundary? And there seem to be a lot of examples of, not just in Germany but globally, where it's clearly nowhere near kind of shouting explicitly racist things at someone in the street. It's I'm not sure how I feel about this level of immigration, or I think this COVID measures are going too far, or where's the evidence for this, that, and the other. And it's like that stuff also gets basically thrown into the same basket with all of the like really, really horrible stuff that most people will agree is horrible.
So, but what would you say about horrible or maybe even distasteful stuff that is being said on the internet? Because I find that it's not always that easy to differentiate between it's this hateful rhetoric or it's just distasteful. And people are allowed to be distasteful.
I agree. And I think that's very different to shouting something racist at someone in the street, where that person might feel very directly threatened, because there's a physical component to it.
Well, shouting at someone in the street, I would say, is already a problem.
Yeah,
definitely. Okay.
Even. Yeah. But online, yes, it's like the boundary between what is, and this is why in the US they don't have hate speech laws, because like where is the line? Yeah,
you said that you weren't a free speech absolutist, and looking at Germany, I have a tendency to be rather a proponent of being a free speech absolutist, because I think that the negative side effects that come in doing the things the way we do them in Germany, the way that people have, kept to go into a court of law because of certain speech issues and everything that comes along with it, it just seems very ineffective. It's not constructive. It just feels like it makes everything very hard and not very. It doesn't. It just makes it more difficult to move. I feel like, and it makes it more difficult to move with your mind as well. I know 100%. I'm using weird words to describe it. So I feel like I think that's where I'm coming from. I understand that things can be distasteful and
I'm fine with the distasteful stuff on the internet, but it is that line, and in some ways people go, well, drawing the line is so hard.
It
just
is.
You just don't draw a line at all. But then even those people would draw a line, which would be that, the US line is direct incitement to violence.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
That to me would be an appropriate line to draw. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
And because Germany is very far from that line.
Yeah.
And as you guys have mapped this ecosystem that also uses government or its tax money to fund a certain way of thinking, and it feels like you're fighting. Is it David against Goliath?
Goliath.
Goliath. Thank you, Goliath. So it feels like you can't even win because obviously the government is on the stronger end of things,
yes.
right?
Except that a lot of people who are doing this work think they're David when they're actually Goliath.
I think now we need to clear up who is who, right?
So, the civil society people working with the government, they think they're David.
So the small guy.
And they think that Goliath is Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and et cetera, and that they're kind of joining forces with the state to defeat, the Elon Musk Goliath. And this is also part of the problem where, there are huge problems with the amount of wealth and concentration of power that people like Zuckerberg and Musk have. But this kind of very heavily statist, government-led approach to speech management is also not the answer. So I feel like we're getting squeezed between this kind of the state and the oligarchs, and most of the people who are concerned about kind of freedom online have decided, well, fascism's coming. The oligarchs, the oligarchs are coming. So we just have to, join in with the government for a united front to stop, fascism 2.0. And therefore we kind of throw out all of our previous principles and values around free speech and expression because, there's a crisis. I don't think it decreases the polarization at all. I think, in fact, it increases polarization because you delegitimize and talk down to all of these people who, the majority of which have legitimate ideas, opinions, and grievances and are allowed to be heard, even if sometimes they're ugly. And they get thrown in the same basket of, neo-Nazis or really extreme racists, etc. And that just breeds resentment. And they go, well, I'm not a neo-Nazi or extreme racist. And just because I have this opinion about what I think are the right levels of immigration or the right settings for the COVID response, etc., I'm told I'm the worst person in the world.
A threat, a proper threat to democracy.
Yeah, you're a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
A threat to your own country.
So, but I think this is a great point that you're making. People at these NGOs, they think they're fighting the broligarchs. Did you say broligarchs?
Yeah.
That's such a great term. So
not my term.
Yeah, but so they think they're fighting them, and they don't realize that they're actually fighting the little people who are just posting their stuff online, and so they don't see that.
I don't know. Maybe some of them see that they're making a compromise, but I think a lot of them don't. I think they're seeing that the Goliath is the broligarchs, and they're David, and they're kind of teaming up with the government.
So interesting.
But I think both of them are Goliaths.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so there needs to carve out another position, which is, we need more Davids, and because there's not only one Goliath, essentially. And part of the work that I'm trying to do is convince the people who have teamed up with the government to say, who used to be the kind of free speech people, say, hey, be careful here. You might be kind of making compromises that are going to lead us down to a very dark place. Well, I think already have.
Andrew, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Although, your voice is strained just a bit.
Talking too much.
I want to tell everyone that I will link the report down below. It's in German and English. Also den Bericht könnt ihr auch auf Deutsch lesen. Ich verlinke alles unten in die Kommentare. And this Interview, I don't know, I'm switching back and forth. This is crazy sometimes. And dieses Interview werdet ihr auch auf Deutsch auf diesem Kanal finden. Es wird übersetzt werden, weil ich dieses Thema so zentral und so wichtig finde. So thank you again, Andrew, and thank you for being part of this report. I think it's super important and very interesting to read. So I really hope a lot of people read it. I will link it all down below. I'll spread it across all my socials. And thank you so much for being part of it.
Great. Thank you.